Got it. Cervantes' Don Quixote is well worth reading, and in my case, well worth reading. It's what I did earlier in the week, and it's as funny the last time you read it as it is the first time. It's a wonderful comic novel. It's a kind of mock epic, and it's the first great novel in the Western tradition. And it's worth considering that the novel is going to supersede the epic as the characteristic literary form of the Enlightenment. So after 1600, the epic is going to go into a kind of eclipse. The last great English language epic will be Paradise Lost, and the last great Western epic will be Goethe's Faust. But this new genre is more in keeping and more satisfactory in the new circumstances that will emerge. Literacy is becoming more widespread, and the advent of the printing press allows relatively cheap copies of books to be made accessible to people that aren't extraordinarily wealthy or connected to the church. So Cervantes is a pioneer here. He's creating a new, or he's investing a great deal of talent in a new genre, and the results are outstanding. Now, the novel is in two parts. The first is published in 1605, the second in 1615. So he's a contemporary of Shakespeare. And his life was very different from that of Shakespeare. He embraced the military tradition that's so important in Spanish culture during the 17th century and also the 16th century, but also he fights for the crown and for Catholicism, and he lost an arm at the very important Battle of Lepanto, 1578. Now, I don't know for a fact, because it hasn't happened to me, but my sense is that there's nothing that will reduce a man's martial inclinations any greater than having an arm torn off in battle. Still worse, not only did Cervantes lose an arm, but he was enslaved by the Turks for 5 years and was eventually ransomed and brought back to Spain. But slavery and being maimed in battle will change a man, and it certainly seems evident in Cervantes and in Don Quixote. Now, this is a remarkable book in a lot of ways. First of all, the journey motif, which holds all of Western literature together, is here again. Don Quixote is going to go on a journey, and in the first volume, the journey ends with him going home, but it's a kind of ironic nostos, an ironic homecoming, because it doesn't seem to really settle the issue. The end of the first volume begs for a sequel. Second, Don Quixote is a remarkable kind of hero because he's a comic hero, right? What's funny about him is that he's mad and he thinks that he's a knight errant. And the problem is, by the time we're at 1600, most of Europe has moved on from a medieval outlook, yet much of the medieval outlook, knighthood and aristocracy and a disdain for commerce, Spanish culture is much slower in picking these up. Now, commercial capitalism had become very important in the Italian city-states several centuries earlier. And during the 16th century, it expands quite considerably. That's why Thomas More talks about the sheep that eat men in England. But a similar kind of increase in commerce was found in the Low Countries and also in France. Not so much in Spain. Spain held on to certain kinds of medieval holdovers. And this might be thought of as the main theme of the book. Spanish culture is Don Quixote. It's great and has many virtues, but regrettably, it's crazy. Sancho Panza, in my reading, is the voice of, or at least one of the voices of Cervantes. He's the one reminding the Spanish that, well, that's not really a giant, it's a windmill. And that's not really a magical helmet, that's a wash basin. So what he's doing is deflating the mythic inflation of Spanish culture's self-conception. Now, one thing worth noting is that Don Quixote is quite a strange hybrid, because although he is in many respects a laughable figure, and you can't help but find many of his mistakes very funny, as Unamuno said, we laugh at Don Quixote's mistakes, but we never laugh at his intentions, because his intentions aren't ludicrous. They're actually quite serious and noble-minded. So Sancho is Cervantes' alter ego. He has a plebeian realism that is a foil for Don Quixote's misplaced idealism. But in some ways, the problem that emerges is that although Don Quixote gets beaten and thrashed and treated very harshly, manhandled constantly because of his mistaken idealism, much the same happens to Sancho as well. So being plebeian and realistic doesn't keep you from getting your butt kicked. So part of the problem is that life is going to give you suffering anyway. You can have certain advantages with the kind of prosaic realism, but it turns out that idealism, even if misplaced and incoherent, has certain advantages. You don't get treated that much worse, and in some cases you get treated better. There's one wonderful scene where they're eating absolutely disgusting, inedible food. It's moldy bread and horrible stuff. And Don Quixote, of course, is convinced that this is the best thing he's ever eaten and relishes it with great gusto. A plebeian, a kind of farmer like Sancho, looks at it and says, oh, this is inedible. But Don Quixote says, well, then go hungry if you want. And he ends up eating it anyway. Who's better off, the sane man or the madman? Sometimes it's hard to tell. Okay, now with regard to the writing, the book that most reminds me of Don Quixote is, strangely enough, Moby Dick. The reason why is that both of these books desperately need an editor, and that, in my view, I know it's an unusual view, but both of them might be twice as good if they were half as long. I'm not sure that we need this vast brick of a book in order to do what the books do. But despite that, and despite the overwritten style, it's a book that is very thought-provoking, and it comments on the human condition in ways that are very powerful and very moving. The key things in the book, because look, I didn't assign you the entire book because it's not necessary. The book's plot is actually rather weak. Or actually, both of the volumes, the plot is rather weak. Instead, each of the adventures has a kind of cellular structure. It stands alone. And this would have been suitable to the audience that got it. Remember that although literacy is more widespread than it had been, it's still a fairly unusual thing. So if travelers were to go to an inn, the innkeeper might choose to explain to them or read to them a particular passage, like Mambrino's helmet or the part about the windmills. And that would be all for a day. Everyone would get a good laugh. And you could put the book down. Reading it continuously, for me anyway, becomes a little difficult because in some ways it's the same joke told over and over and over again under different circumstances. Don Quixote doesn't know where he is or what he's doing. He mistakes appearance for reality, and his appearances are unique to him. Everybody else can't figure out what he's doing, and then they give him a beating. So yeah, we're we're laughing because of Schadenfreude, and we like the idea that Don Quixote is a very humorous individual. In addition to Sancho and Don Quixote, there are a couple of other characters we need to know. The first is, of course, Dulcinea. She's a whore that Don Quixote makes his lady fair. He's fallen in courtly love with her. So he thinks that she's a princess, and everybody else knows that she's a hooker. Another character that I happen to like very much, and in some ways brings us back to Moby Dick, is Rocinante. That's Don Quixote's horse. And I must confess, I have a liking for novels in which animals get to be characters. Certainly the whale in Moby Dick is a character. I mean, when Ahab comes after him and hits him with a harpoon, or has him hit with a harpoon, the whale takes it personally, which is kind of a strange thing. A little later on, we're going to be reading Dickens' Hard Times, and there's a wonderful dog that knows how to do tricks in the circus, and his name is Merrylegs, and Merrylegs is a lovely dog, and it's a character too. And I sort of like animal characters. I like to extend the dramatis personae. Now, the real Don Quixote is in fact a minor nobleman named Alonso Quijano. And the dedication to the first volume and the dedication to the second volume are crucial. All right, read those with a special care. In the first volume, the author's dedication and preface, he says that he got some advice as to how to write a bestseller. The suggestion is that you include a lot of footnotes, random Latin phrases, which will baffle everyone, and make various references to the Bible. Now, I have occasionally seen this strategy employed by undergraduates, and let me warn you away from it. It doesn't make for an especially coherent essay, nor would it actually help Don Quixote, the novel, not the individual. Romances. He's been reading stories of chivalry and famous military feats by Amadis of Gaul and various other writers of what you might think of as medieval make-believe. And what we get in this dedication is an ironic distancing of the narrator, who is Cervantes, from the book itself. Now, the book, when it's published in 1605, the first volume, it's a terrific success. People like it. It's universally admired, or almost universally. And it's arguably the canonical work of Spanish literature. And if you compare that to the second preface and dedication, to the second volume, something greatly has changed. And what's changed is this. It's such a well-regarded book that some ghostwriter decided that he was going to write a sequel to Don Quixote, and he took Cervantes' character and Cervantes' name and published it, and this drove Cervantes mad. He worked very hard on creating this beautiful work of art, and now some hack has taken over and pretended to be him. So in the dedication to the second volume, Don Quixote flogs this pseudo Don Quixote, this pseudo second volume, and says that this is the worst kind of abuse of art, because someone without talent has destroyed and disfigured a work which is of consummate genius. But it goes further than that. Cervantes attacks the spurious Cervantes, who had written this spurious second volume. And at that point, he breaks the distinction between the novel and real life. So there's a permeable membrane between the work of art and the world. Cervantes speaks in his own voice, in his own novel, which is a very unusual thing to do. making asides to the reader or to the listener or to the viewer is a rather unusual technique. You see it more often in plays than in novels. If you think, and it actually has a technical Greek name because there's a technical Greek word for everything. In Aristophanes, for example, when he makes asides, it's called a parabasis. And something like that also happens if you read Pirandello or if you read Brecht. On the other hand, in a novel, it's perhaps less often seen. The one that comes to mind immediately is Charlotte Bronte. Those asides that begin with "Dear Reader" are Charlotte Bronte's voice inserted into a novel, which is a rather strange place to find them. Cervantes claims that the real author, and this is in the second dedication, second preface, that the real author is not even him. The real author is allegedly a Muslim historian named Sid Hamet Benegali. And he says that all he did was take the story of Don Quixote, which had been written by this Islamic historian, and translate it into Spanish for popular consumption. Now, there is no such Muslim historian. So what Don Quixote is doing here is inventing a non-existent source for a novel that he made up. And he's talking to it as if he were entirely detached from this. And at the end of the second volume, this Muslim historian will speak up and explain that the reason why he wrote this book was to mark the end of the age of chivalry. What's strange about this is that there is no such person giving us this aside. This is actually really the voice of Cervantes himself. And not only does Cervantes himself talk about the plagiarizer and the intellectual or artistic property thief, but both Sancho and Don Quixote talk about the spurious second volume in the real second volume. So what we have is a permeability between art and life, which is very strange, very unique, and in some ways sounds like the kind of thing that some late 20th century author might have thought up. So it's in some ways quite experimental in its organization. And when the characters talk about real things and imaginary characters are have attributed to them real things, and Don Quixote claims to be somebody else, or actually Cervantes claims to be somebody else, we see Cervantes speaking with multiple voices from inside and from outside his own book. So it's a very strange concatenation of things. Now, in the structure, the plot of the novel is pretty weak. We have various adventures that Don Quixote goes on and brings Sancho Panza with him. And they all pretty much turn out the same way. They get beaten and left by the side of the road. And what we get is a sort of, how can I put this? A sort of mock epic in which the foibles of an entire culture are pilloried, but also admired. That's the interesting thing about it. All right. Now, generally speaking, comedies end in marriage, tragedies end in death. Comedies are about the first half of human life. Tragedies are about the second. And the difficulty with the first volume of Don Quixote is that it doesn't end in a marriage, and it doesn't really resolve the issues. Although he's had many interesting adventures, he only comes home because his friends have found a way to convince him that he's under a spell, and he goes home and we don't get a fully satisfactory ending. So in some ways, this is just begging for a sequel, and that in some ways may have helped motivate the false and a spurious version that was first written. The things that go on, the misadventures of Don Quixote, are genuinely funny. A couple that are worth noting is, of course, the windmills. That's the most famous one. But Mambrino's helmet is really great because he steals from a barber a wash basin, which he thinks is a magic helmet. And of course, the end is that he and Sancho take a thrashing. One of my favorite portions, and this is not as well known as others, but he is sick, and so he's given something called the balsam of Firebrass. Now, the balsam of Firebrass is such a poisonous, wretched medicine that it makes Don Quixote deathly sick. But when he eventually sleeps it off and gets beyond the medicine, he feels that he's been cured. And the reason why is that he no longer is being made sick by the medicine. So the balsam of Firebrass is medicine that may be worse than the disease. I know a little bit about this, actually. It's a personal thing. I had, a long time ago, I had chemotherapy, and I was being helped by various nurses and doctors because you got to pour that poisonous stuff into yourself. And while hooked up to the IV, I happened to mention that, this seems to me a lot like the balsam of Firebrass. It feels so good when you stop. And nobody got the joke except one Spanish-speaking nurse who apparently liked Don Quixote and understood what I was talking about. She said, yeah, that's about what it is. So there's much to be, there are many references here that that connect to the real world and to real experience. Now, when he comes home, it's like Odysseus's homecoming, except that it's ironic at the end of the first volume. He's come home because he's crazy, and he's been persuaded that he's under a spell, and it's a very unsatisfactory ending. We're going to get a much more satisfactory ending, a tragic ending at the end of the second volume. He has more adventures in the true second volume, and he's eventually defeated by the Knight of the White Moon, which is one of his friends in disguise. And the idea is that by defeating him, hopefully we'll be able to bring him back to sanity, and we'll be doing him the great favor of curing him of his madness. Now, here's an interesting point, all right? When Don Quixote actually is cured of his madness, and he goes home, and he says ruefully to everyone around him, I've wasted my life. I've been a madman. I thought I was a knight errant, but in fact, I'm just a crazy nobleman. Now, everyone around him who had laughed at him all through the novel and who had treated him as an object of scorn immediately insists that he's wrong, and that in fact he really is Don Quixote, and that in fact what he's taking, his newly found sanity, is a mistake. So Don Quixote is going to die at the end of that scene. That's why you have chapter 74 from the second volume. That's his death scene. And remember that it's characters to be tragedies, not comedies that end in death. And also remember that every great comedian is capable of eliciting pathos. Pathos will come in any comic character if he actually finds out who he is and what he is. Imagine Homer Simpson. He's a dope. He does all kinds of stupid stuff. But imagine for a moment that he recognizes what a fool he is. Then you can't help but feel pity for him. You can't help but feel bad for him. And that's true for pretty much all comic heroes. The thing you don't want is to have them realize what schmucks they are, because if they do find out, the result is going to be pathetic, not funny. So every great comedian is capable of getting that. And Cervantes shows what a great comedian he is by giving Don Quixote a tragic ending. Now, what kills Don Quixote? An overdose of reality. Yeah, reality kills Don Quixote. And everyone around him says, no, no, you are Don Quixote. You are not a minor nobleman. And what you think is sanity now, in fact, is genuinely mistaken. You're earlier, insane self, that was the real you, and that was the accurate account of the world. What is implicit here is the idea that everyone around him, despite the fact that they laugh at him, has been living vicariously through Don Quixote. And although they scorn his illusions, these are also life-giving illusions. And this formulates, or at least gestures, in the direction of certain very, very important problems in understanding human nature. If you'll remember that in the 19th century, Nietzsche talked about the importance of life-giving illusions. Now, of course, that has no influence on Don Quixote, but the idea that life requires some degree of madness and that reason or rationality by itself is not enough. If you were exclusively reasonable and had no illusions, you would lose the will to live. That is built into the idea of Don Quixote. And everybody around him, although they don't say it in so many words, has been feeding off Don Quixote's illusions. And it suggests that the distinction between sanity and madness, the distinction between reason and unreason, the distinction between truth and illusion, may be murkier than we suspect. And they may not have the properties that we usually attribute to them. So one way of reading that is that in the largest sense, the balsam of Firebrass is reason. In other words, it's a medicine that will kill you. And it kills Don Quixote because there's no cure for it. And that is a very interesting can of worms. So Don Quixote is feverish. He insists that he's no longer a knight errant, and he dies in a most pathetic way. You can't help but feel bad for him. And it would have been a blessing and a mercy if he had not actually found out who he really was. In that respect, it's the opposite of most of the great Shakespearean tragedies, which are primarily about the question of self-knowledge. To thine own self be true. Now, the life-giving illusions that Don Quixote loses sap the vitality even of the people around him. And everyone is deeply sad, not just because Don Quixote is dead, but Don Quixote's life-giving illusions died with him. And where will that leave us? Well, this generates a whole bunch of interesting big problems, and or it's certainly connected to them, not generates them. And it's in some ways central to the Western intellectual tradition. Let me see if I can back up a little bit and explain to you why. All of the Greek and Roman thinkers, regardless of their philosophical school, were all in agreement that what you need for a satisfactory life is to be reasonable. If we could just be fully rational and govern and subordinate all the other domains of human life, imagination, fancy, emotion, whatever else you want, that we would then be able to live the best possible human life. So that the idea of the Greco-Roman tradition amounts to this: reason is enough. If you look at somebody like Marcus Aurelius, yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. And yet, for all his heroism, there's a sense in which Marcus Aurelius is a deeply unhappy man. He marks in some ways the end of that Greco-Roman tradition, where the idea is that reason is enough. The next great text that we're going to get in the Western tradition after Marcus Aurelius is a turning of the corner. That's going to be Augustine's Confessions. And the big message that we get with the invasion of Christianity by Augustine, who is well schooled in Greco-Roman thought, is a new idea that reason is not enough, that reason by itself is insufficient for a happy or even a satisfactory human life. And this is a very troubling question. How would you know? Um, and believe me, it's an enormous can of worms. It's very difficult. But if you look at Augustine's Confessions, he intellectually accepts Christianity, but he's still walking up and down, talking to himself, tearing his hair out, because intellectually accepting Christianity is not sufficient. You need reason plus something else. And in the case of Augustine, what he needs is an infusion of divine grace. And it's that reason plus that allows him to fully embrace Christianity. And in that sense, and that you should think about this before you, and not react to it quickly, but St. Augustine is the first romantic because he says that reason is not enough. Now, if you know the very earliest Star Trek, and that must be 50 years old now, there was a character called Dr. Spock, who was Mr. Logic and constantly being reasonable and such. He was in some ways a parody of Greco-Roman thought because he spends all his time being reasonable and rational, subordinating his emotions. And he seems in many ways mechanical, like a machine. And the kind of Captain Kirk, who's a kind of fully developed, fully integrated human, knows how great and excellent Spock's insights are, but he is always subordinate to a fully integrated personality. In other words, most people that look at Dr. Spock don't say, wow, that's what I want to be. They say, well, look, it's great to be rational, but maybe being rational isn't everything. Or in the case of Don Quixote, maybe making sense isn't everything. And that is a can of worms. Now, there are two ways we can go here. And for those of you that want to explore this question more thoroughly, have a look at my lecture on Kierkegaard. But here's the idea. Is reason enough? Well, those who want to maintain a purely rational outlook, here I'm thinking about somebody like the new atheists, like Christopher Hitchens. That's understandable and it's respectable. I mean, it's a noble and intellectually serious choice. On the other hand, I'm not sure that rationality itself is entirely sufficient for a happy, satisfactory, fully integrated human life. So that's the worry. Now, on the other hand, you have a different worry. You don't get your problem solved. I'm just going to make problems for everybody. Those that want to be more than rational, here's my warning to you. People that attempt to be more than rational almost always end up being less than rational. Okay. The attempt to be more than rational generally ends up being less than rational. So we have two different problems, and neither of them is very satisfactory. For the Greeks, the highest value is, and the Romans too, the highest value is reason. For the Christians, the highest value is love. Okay, how do we decide which is the highest value? And how do we show our work, like in math class? In other words, if you decide that reason is sufficient by itself, or that love trumps reason, how do you know? What counts as evidence for such a thing? You have a look at my Kierkegaard lecture to understand why this is a real mess. But think of it like this. The attempt to create a rational account of the world is like a 1,000,000-piece jigsaw puzzle with 1,000,000 minus 1 pieces. No matter what you do, there's always something missing. The attempt to create a more than rational account of the world is like a 1,000,000-piece jigsaw puzzle with 1,000,001 pieces. You don't get any satisfaction that way either. The question is, and this is something I talk about in the work I had been writing before I got sick. I think the ultimate problem of our species is how to reconcile love and reason. In other words, I don't want to do without either, but I'm not sure that love is reasonable, and I'm not sure that reason is loving. There is no shortage of cruel people who are reasonable, and there are no shortage of loving people that don't make any sense at all. You will never be able to find suitable means by which to create good ends unless you're rational. In other words, love requires rational deployment. On the other hand, reason cannot tell you, here I'm thinking of Kant, of Hume, reason seems unable to tell us what ends we're supposed to achieve. Being benevolent to people, you could find reasonable ways to do that, but you can also find reasonable ways in the sense of rational relation of ends and means to being awful to people. Genocide can be conducted reasonably, at least in terms of the technical means used. So here's the problem. Think of a Venn diagram. Love and reason overlap imperfectly. There's a tiny crescent on each side that only has one. And how shall we decide which way to go? There are some benevolent, loving things that don't make sense. There are also some reasonable things that are dreadful and awful and horrific. How to reconcile love and reason is, I think, the problem of our species and the problem of any culture worth considering. I myself have thought about this for a lifetime, and the answer is I don't know. My sense is that these are the two most important things in human life, and I wouldn't want to do without them. But if you were to ask me to give a rational account of why I think that Christian love is a good thing, I don't know what I'm supposed to say. Nonetheless, I think the parable of the Good Samaritan is one of the great achievements of the human mind. If you were to ask me the opposite, in what respect reason is loving, my sense is that it can be, but it isn't necessarily. There are some very rational, very evil people, and there is no guarantee that compassion and rationality will overlap. That's that other end of the crescent. So the problem that Don Quixote leaves me with is this. We can't afford not to be rational, but it seems like we can't afford to be exclusively rational. The problem is when you try and be more than rational, almost always you end up less than rational. So we're on a kind of Mobius strip. We go round and round and don't seem to make any progress. So my best understanding is that when Augustine shows us that love requires a combination of grace and sanity, he's right. And that reason by itself, a lack of madness in or poetry in your life, can be fatal. On the other hand, the dangers of fanaticism and unreason are at least equally awful. So I give no break to anybody. I think that Cervantes gives no break to anybody, and he leaves us wondering about the main problems of the human condition.